Hello, all you lovely folks out there. Let's take a look at a little workshop that I held a few weeks back and paint a model to a somewhat decent standard. A few weeks ago, I held a little bit of a workshop at a local con, the Midgard Convention here in Iceland, and it was great fun. Now, of course, doing something like this needs a community, and our community can be one of the greatest around. First, I was contacted by Midgard if I wanted to have a little bit of a workshop with painting models, and I was all in with that. Next, I started looking around if anybody out there might want to supply a model for said workshop. I contacted Creaturecaster and Canada, and they were surprisingly interested in it. After a little bit of back and forth with them, we settled on a model which I really dug and really fit the idea I was going for this workshop. Now, having the model and having the space to have the workshop is one thing. There's a lot of extra supplies that goes into a workshop like this, and that's where the exceedingly friendly local game shop helped out. And they supplied all the paints, the wet palettes, the brushes, everything for this workshop, which was really, really great. Also, the model needed to be printed as I had STL files. So another Icelandic company jumped in and helped with the printing of those. That's Töfrar. Now, Midgard, the convention, Nexus, the store here in Iceland, Creaturecaster, and Töfrar, Country and Magic, are linked down below. If you're interested in any of those things, by all means check them out. Now the model itself, it's called Sweettooth, and it's kind of this rotting, bloated carcass thing. Of course, you could substitute him into your Nurgle army if you're playing Warhammer or Warhammer 40k. But in this case, we were just painting the model. The idea behind what I wanted to teach was to paint models in a somewhat quick fashion and with relatively easy techniques and still get a decent result. The idea around the workshop was like a stepping stone from beginner to intermediate, so a little bit of experience beforehand is really helpful, but it was not maybe necessary, as came to be proven during the workshop, as I had a few rookies there that also attended, and they worked out really well. Now let's just start by painting the model. I painted one here at my desk before I went to Midgard, because of course you need to have some sort of beginning step and reference before you start, so you know what you're going to teach. And I had a fair inkling that I had no idea what I was going to teach, but surprisingly I had something to say, which was nice. Before we started actually painting the model at the convention, I gave them a little bit of a primer and a little bit of a base tone to work from, because it takes a little bit of time sometimes to wait for the primer and the zenithal to dry, so I did that a few days earlier so everything was good and ready when we started. I started with an olive-colored base, and then I did a little bit of a zenithal over top of that, focusing on the face and the hat and a little bit of overspray to give it that starting focal point. The zenithal was done with a bone-ish khaki color to keep the tones a little bit on the warmer side, because it's a natural-looking skin tone that we're going for. The first step that I decided to teach was to Slapchop. Now, Slapchop, of course, is a quite simple method, but I want a more ambitious version of Slapchop. So it's a few extra steps and you get a nicer result. Of course, with Slapchop, even though we have the zenithal over the olive color, we need a little bit of a dry brush. So I used white scar and dry brushed that over the skin, but still keeping in line where the focus point is going to be. So focusing on the face, on just the ridges, and going very slowly and carefully and only a small portion at a time. Next, we can actually start working on the skin tone, and we're going to work on all the natural tones, be it skin, his trophies, bones, tongue, maggots, what have you. I'm going to use a plague bearer's flesh in a very thin coat over the entirety of the skin. It works well with the olive green that we already have, and the highlights and the dry brushed highlights. It's better to really pay attention now and be quite careful so we won't touch any other parts like the bones and the tongues and the maggots and everything like that. Because if we do a little bit of an extra step here, just being careful, they really save up on time later on. Next, we're working on the maggots and the mouth, or if it's maggots or tongues, I don't really know. It can be either or. And they are going to get a thin layer, again, thin layers are the key here, of Magus purple over the top. And again, being careful not to contaminate the skin tone with the purple hue. After that, all the horns and the teeth and the bones and everything in that milieu will get a good layer of Agrex Earthshade. Now be careful with pooling, and it's okay to let it pool a little bit, just in the right spaces, in the recesses, maybe on the undersides, to exaggerate the depth of the parts that need maybe a little bit more exaggeration or a little bit more depth. We're going to do the same thing with all the skin-colored pieces of the model, his trophies, the hats, the hands that are hanging from his belt and stuff like that. Now he has these base colors down now, and in many cases they're just going to stay like they are. But this is Slapchop with a little bit of an ambition, so we're still going to work a few more steps into it. Keeping in line with the natural part that we're going for, we are going to add a few extra depth and layers to the skin to make it a little bit more unhealthy and a little bit more real. We're going to use some Caribou Crimson, and we're going to thin it out, maybe 50-50 with water on the wet palette, so it keeps on being moist and a little bit damp. And we're going to trace that gently into all the folds and feather it out from the folds. We're also going to put it in a little bit more of an ambitious quantity over the more strained areas of him, like around the open wounds, maybe in them, around the mouth that's ripping on his shoulder, and all the tears in his skin. Make all the skin look a little bit more unhealthy, a little bit more strained, a little bit more worn and, well, disgusting. And disgusting is good for these kinds of model. And of course, with this model and with all your more bloated zombie types, or well, skinny zombie types if you will, you can use similar methods, and they're quick, they're not difficult, and you still get a more interesting result than just regular Slapchop. Because skin isn't normally just the one tone, and for this kind of beast, a really unhealthy, rougey color really sells the disgustingness of it. Again, we're going to use it a little bit over the tongue and the mouth and all those maggoty tongue things on him. It's going to darken down the tone a little bit. It's going to give us a little bit of redness to the purple base. And it gives us more of a raw muscle feeling. Well, in my opinion at least. After all those extra steps on the regular Slapchop, we went in a different direction. Because I'm teaching a few different methods in my little workshop to get a little bit of extra bang for your buck. So we're going to go into different ways to layer. First, we're going to start with a little bit of wet blending, but we're adding a tiny nuance of texture on it in the end. For the pants, I went for a semi-bluish tone, not very much unlike jeans. I started out with 3 colors, the Fang, Rust Grey, and Fenrisian Grey. All very nice jean colors. I mixed them together, well, the Fang and the Rust Grey, maybe 2 parts Fang to 1 part Rust Grey, as a mid-tone for what I wanted to do next. Then I just put a single layer of the Fang over the pants, because I like to start with the darkest tone when I'm doing a little bit of wet blending and get a nice base coat of that before the next steps. When that is dry, I put another layer, a rather relatively thick, and then I start dragging the mixed color that we made earlier into this to create some sort of a mid-tone. And we're really focusing this around the general highlight area, bigger parts, so the side of the pants, the front of the pants, so the shadows are in the shadow area, and we get this large area that is somewhat highlighted. So we have this tone from dark to light that we're really gonna kick up a little bit more in just the next step. The next step is doing a similar thing, but we're going for the light tone area that we created, and I'm using that mid-tone, putting that down, and then wet blending the general rust gray into that, creating highlights. And now we are focusing on the folds of the pants, doing small pieces at a time just to get those folds nice and highlighted, but still it's a little bit of a big highlight because we want to add a little bit of a sharper highlight in the next step after this. For the next step, to create the illusion of some wear to the pants, I use a little bit of edge highlighting. Now, not really edge highlighting like heavy metal does or anything like that. It's more of showing the wear. So we're just doing a few little bit of slashes here and there on the top of the folds, on the bottom of the pants, and maybe scrapes on the pants where the knees are and stuff like that, adding a little bit of realism to it. And I think that really does sell it as strained and a little bit more interesting. The next step is again layering, but now we're not doing wet blending. We are more doing a stippling thing with some extra finicky bits just to give another texture going so it sells as a different fabric and it looks somewhat interesting. We're going for the apron and the back cloth of the guy. We're going to start with Rakarth flesh, which is a nice semi-dark brownish skin tony kind of color. And we're going to just use it as a layer to create the base tone that we'll be working over. Then I'll put Agrax over the entirety of the thing. Yes, I am an Agrax man through and through. And on these dirty kind of models, they really do work. Once that has dried, I again use Rakarth flesh, and I started by making a mid-tone again, with tiny dots here and there, creating a fun texture to the model, a little bit on the higher side, keeping the shadows still in the dark, just putting down the dots here and there, quite a lot of them. And then when we have our mid-tone again, I'm getting my flayed one flesh out, and I'm doing more of those dots. But this time around I'm focusing more on getting the dots to the edges and or the real highlight areas of this loinclothy skin type thing. The main thing is to be somewhat patient, keep the paint a little bit thin so it doesn't dry on the brush and you can get maybe a few dots down before you start putting more paint into the brush. This makes for an interesting looking layer, and you can use this when you're doing wool or some dirty or worn fabric or something rough. It really does help sell that. Next, we're going to do quick layering with lines. And this is really handy for when you're doing wood-like objects. Now, the model doesn't have that much wood. It has a little bit of wood on the handles on its two weapons, so we're gonna put it there, but that does help to show how you can do it. I'm using dryad bark now, and I'm using that again as the base color, because I like to start working with the darkest tone when I'm layering, especially for natural looking things. Now, if I was doing a bright color, say white, blonde khaki or yellow, I would not perhaps start with the darkest tone because it takes a lot of layers to work up to the mid-tone. But for this, it's okay to start with the darkest tone. I'm using dryad bark and I'm making the base layer, like I said. And then I'm mixing a little bit of a thin Rakarth flesh into it and dragging that along the wood grain to create more wood grain so it looks like it's more natural. Again, a thin layer of Rakarth flesh on top of that, dragging that again over the lines I made before, just thinner, and you get this extra detail. It makes it look a little bit more 3D and more interesting. But that's enough about that. Sometimes it's okay to be lazy when it's not worth it to spend a long time doing something simple. So for the ropes and the strings on him, I just put down a layer of flayed one flesh and then a healthy helping of appreiciated, and it looks nice enough. when you're creating something for the tabletop or something to play with or for your board games or something like that, you don't have to lose your mind and take all the little ropes with all their stringy little bits and then paint it and shade it and mid-tone again and highlight and etch and whatever. If this is enough for it, then it is enough for it. If you're doing a display piece, of course this is not the way to go. But for this, it's perfectly fine. Now for metallics, and what I wanted to instill with the people that were on the workshop is to be careful in what order you use your paints. So we started out with all the regular paints and then we went into metallics, because you don't want to have to switch water too often, and metallic flakes in the water does not really help when you're still going to paint something else. So we ended with the metallic step. Metallics, well, ruined metallics, to be fair. We're gonna start by mixing together two colors in wet blending. I'm using lead belcher and runefang steel. The lead belcher is going on everything that I'm going to have metallic. And then I'm gonna wet blend runefang steel into it, a little bit on the forward side of the weapons where the light might be gleaming a little bit. So it's almost like an MM, a TMM. So we're doing some gradients, but we're still using metallic colors. It gives it a little bit of extra life, and it's not too much of an extra step. Then after this is all dried and it looks fairly shiny and not fitting for the model, I'm going to use typhus corrosion. I love typhus corrosion. I'm a big fan of typhus corrosion. It does all the things I wanted to do in a quick and simple way. But I thin it out quite a bit because I want it to be a little bit thinner, because I want to focus more when I'm putting it, and it's quite thick and sandy and globby to begin with. And I'm going to put that near the hilt and where water might seep, and I'm going to feather it out, because feathering can really help with this. Just a little bit more moistness on the brush and dragging the brownish sandy paint a little bit from the main source of it. After this is dry, and it takes of course a few minutes to dry, but not too much if you put a lot of water in it for some reason, in my opinion, I'm gonna put some acrylics, and again I'm gonna put it on the same places where I put the typhus corrosion, just to mix it a little bit better with the metallic, but I'm going over most of the metallic bits with acrylics. But I'm again using it thin, and I'm feathering it out, keeping the blade, or the edge of the blade, a little bit out of the equation, maybe a little bit of brown there, but we want that to be sharp because he's using it, and therefore rust and corrosion will wipe away somewhat quickly. The edges are all a little bit lighter than near the handles, and that looks quite nice. You can also use a little bit of stippling now, putting a little bit of extra acrylics on your brush and just stipple it here and there into the holes and stuff like that to give it another more ruined and older flavor to it. Now this looks like a brown and quite dirty little weapon, and all his weapons look a little bit brown and dirty, but they don't really look like rust yet now, not in my opinion. So I'm going back into the same area with a little bit of Gryph-hound orange, and I'm thinning that down really heavily, just so there's a tint of this orange color, and we're going to place that into the more rustier areas where the typhus corrosion is a little bit thicker, where it's a little bit more sandy, and then we get this nice rust effect. The brown will become a little bit more orange and yellowish where it's a little bit higher. Everything looks properly ruined, but now we want a little bit of sharpness to it again. So, Nacron compound, a little bit of dry brushing, and Bob's your uncle, niece, and grandmother. Finally, after all this is done, we're gonna add a little bit of flavor to the model. He looks nice, but he needs a little bit of flavor. So let's start by adding a little bit of shine to his mouth and his tongue and all those tonguey maggots that are here and there. A bit of art coat, maybe 1 part art coat, 2 parts water, thin it out. You can of course use Lamia medium or something like that instead, but why use Lamia medium into art coat? I don't know. But thin it out and put it over his tongue, the maggots, his mouth. It'll give it a nice, not too exaggerated shine, but still looking quite unhealthy. And of course, we're gonna use blood. And it's blood from the blood god, my favorite weird paint. And we're gonna put it on the hatchet, and we have to really focus on how we're putting it on. We have to think about the story of the blood. You can just put a glob on the edge and it looks like blood. But goody gumdrops to that, we are still gonna work on it a little bit more. I'm gonna put a little bit on the edge, and you're gonna think about how he used the weapon, how he chopped. So we're putting a little bit of blood on, and then we're dragging it in the direction of his momentum, if you will. So we get this choppy effect on the hatchet. We never really touched on the base in this workshop because we were focusing on the guy. I just threw a little bit of grey paint on it, a black wash, and called it a day. Like I said, this workshop was great fun. I enjoyed myself immensely. I enjoyed that it was sat for an hour a day and people were there for 3.5 hours sometimes. It was really exhilarating for me. And it was really fun to show people new methods and watching people really want to learn and being really enthusiastic. And it was great. I'm hoping that next year they will see it fit to invite me again, because I am very willing to do something like this again. I have ideas already for something interesting. But now let's take a look at the end result of the guy. We're gonna start out with what he looked like. And then the model I used for demonstration on the workshop. It's weird looking, because I was using bits of the methods here and there and not really fully painting him during the workshop, so it looked quite bizarre. And then, of course, the end result that I painted up before the workshop and showed people during it, so they could see what we were actually going for and have this end goal in mind using the same methods I was teaching and the same paints. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me here today. It's been wonderful to have you. And there are links down below, all those wonderful companies and people that helped out with this little workshop of mine. By all means, check them out. Hopefully Midgard will be back next year. I have no doubt about that. Also, the link for my Patreon and various social media stuff. You can check that out if you like. I'd appreciate it. But anyway, thank you again. Let the colors flow, and farewell.